to the second of XR short talks with people who are doing interesting things in Swansea linked to climate change and climate emergency and biodiversity. We began last week. We had a really interesting talk about participatory budgeting and democracy in Pennard. And we've got there's a whole lot lined up. Dates have not been quite confirmed, but we've got some really interesting speakers coming up on a diverse range of topics. Just very exciting, all the different things that are happening in Swansea. So it's great to do our first proper one, because last week was a bit of a pilot, with our MP for Swansea West, Geraint Davies, who's been MP for over 20 odd years, isn't it, Geraint?
50 years.
50 years.
No, since 2010 I've been Swansea West MP. Yeah.
A long time. And Geraint represented the Labour Party for the whole of the 3 constituents in Swansea when we organised a climate hustings last year. So I think the party in the area do see Geraint as being the spokesperson on climate issues, and he's got a very good track record of bills and bringing people's attention to important aspects of the climate. So we're delighted that he's going to come tonight and share some of the work he's been doing around air pollution, which after our cycle ride yesterday, to raise awareness of the need to have active travel in line with Welsh Government policy and practice, air pollution in Swansea is not very good. Some of the worst in the world, apparently, according to the figures that we saw yesterday. So I think it'll be really interesting to hear what Geraint's got to say. So welcome, Geraint. And I look forward to hearing your presentation. And people will be popping in. 30 people have registered, and obviously 30 people are not here yet. So people will be popping in. So just don't worry about that. And if you want to say anything, the chat is at the bottom, so you can register a chat. Any questions that you've got for Geraint as he's speaking, which you might forget, you can put in the chat. He can see the chat and see what questions you want answered. Okay, thank you. Off we go.
Right, shall I make a start?
Please do.
All right, so first of all, as has just been said, I'm Geraint Davies, local member of Parliament for the last 10 years, and I've taken an active interest in the environment amongst other things over those years. And prior to that, I was in fact working for the Environment Agency Wales, in charge of adapting Wales to climate change in relation to flooding. And I've introduced bills on plastics to reduce the aggregate amount of plastic consumption, tax plastics or something, on fracking to basically stop fracking, and a clean air bill as well. And I sit on the environmental audit committee, then since then on the DEFRA committee. I've just been elected to the Council of Europe, which spans 47 countries, in fact, and in fact just put in a motion about having a strategy across Europe to combat air pollution. But I'm here tonight to talk about air pollution in particular because I chair the all-party parliamentary group on air pollution, and we've put together a strategy on the back of research that's been conducted across the world in various places that have now found a direct relationship between air pollution and coronavirus. Obviously, the whole world is in lockdown over coronavirus, and what we've heard from, in particular, research in Harvard in Boston, was that a 1 microgram per cubic meter increase in the smaller particulates, PM2.5, increases COVID death by 8%. Now in London, PM2.5 can be at 15 micrograms per cubic meter. So what we're saying is if we'd reduced it to 14, which isn't that much of a push, we'd reduce COVID deaths by 8%. And the World Health Organization, and I'm pressing the Environment Bill, which goes to the House at the moment, has specific targets, in particular 10 micrograms per cubic meter for PM2.5, which is a World Health Organization target by 2030, with an interim target of 12.5. Alongside the fact that there's this quantifiable correlation with death, it's also been found by Queen Mary's University College in London that there's a relationship between coronavirus and infection as opposed to deaths. And what has been found is that what's called the ACE2 receptors, which are receptors in your nose and your throat. All I'm saying is that there's also research that shows that air pollution increases the receptiveness of your nose and your throat in terms of the ACE2 receptors. And these ACE2 receptors are what actually the COVID latches onto. So the rate of infection goes up with pollution, as does the rate of death. And in addition, it's been found that particulates may be a transporter of the virus as well. So in other words, the virus literally carries on particulates. And so on the back of this, and also the fact that we already knew that in the United Kingdom, something like over 60,000 people already died prematurely from air pollution due to a variety of conditions, which include heart conditions, heart disease, heart attacks, lung disease, brain problems, in particular strokes, but also dementia. And it also causes all sorts of anxiety and mental health issues amongst adults and children. And the smaller particulates also penetrate unborn babies. And people will be aware, of course, of the Volkswagen scandal, where they actually put defeat devices that would undermine the testing of particulates in tests. And that was revealed, and obviously Volkswagen are being sued in the United States in particular, in Germany, but not here. In addition to that, we've since found that the actual particulate catching devices, filters rather, in cars are now found to hold the particulates, crush them into smaller particulates and spew them out every 300 miles, and therefore making them more dangerous. And the measurement of the particulates is only between this sort of burping, which means that, again, the manufacturers are to blame. So I'm very much of the view that the current guidelines that fossil fuel cars per se, new fossil fuel cars, the target is to stop them in 2035, and I'm pressing that should be 2030. But anyway, that's the sort of background, sort of medical background of why we need, in particular highlighted by the need for clean air as we come out of lockdown, a clean air strategy. And so I put out, the all-party group that I had put out a request for evidence to suggest strategies and ways of reducing infection and improving air quality and saving lives. And that's what I'll share with you now, if I'm able to. Hold on, just checking. Hold on, this is going to work. Just give me 1 second, put the glasses on. And now, can people see that?
Yep.
Okay, right, I'm going to whisk through this because I'm in danger of taking too long. This is available online. I can provide you the link. People can look at it in their own time. But basically, I'll go through a list of suggestions on the back of what I've just said. So the essential focus of this is that everything's science-based, it's a holistic approach, it's inclusive, and there's realistic, practical proposals that we can bring forward in good time. Incidentally, people will know that there's been a relationship between COVID deaths and BAME communities, and it's no surprise in a way. I know the government have pretended they don't know why it is and pretending it's some sort of genetic condition, but the reality is people in BAME communities are more likely, first of all, to be at frontline exposed jobs like bus drivers or in food production or whatever taxi drivers or nurses or in the care system. But in addition, they're more likely to be in poorer communities, which tend to be in more crowded and polluted environments. And so they're more exposed to the pollution that we know, as I've mentioned already, is causing greater death. So, for example, if someone in a BAME community was living in a neighbourhood that had a 1 microgram higher PM 2.5 level, there would be 8% more chance of them dying. And the chances are they're living in much higher differentials than that. So this is a very important issue in terms of equity as well as public health generally. Hold on, I'm going backwards here. I'm not very good at this. So I'll just run quickly through these. The situation in terms of the cost, the economy of pollution is about £20 billion a year. This is big money because if, say, you through a clean air bill, you reduce that to 17 billion and save 3 billion, you could pay back debts at a 1% interest rate of, well, 300 billion pounds of investment. So, in terms of value for money and all these proposals here, the government may resist proposals because they think it costs stuff, but what we're actually talking about here is saving the health service a lot of money and also introducing new forms of green technology that can be exported as well, and therefore an export base as well. First set of proposals, I won't run through all these proposals, but obviously the first issue is about working itself. Clearly more people are working from home, it needs to be continued. Government needs to push forward with digital connectivity, in particular in the rural and the poorest communities. We need a situation where we have more flexible business, that people start and end their work at different times, reduce peak rush hours. No, it's basically a flexible, more sustainable approach to industry, including supporting construction industries to have less polluting machinery, and basically acting in a way that generates less travel, less distance, and less pollution in a more sustainable way. There's been a lot of talk about cycling and pedestrianisation, opening up communities, in particular with social distancing. In Wales, obviously, when we open up pubs and the like and cafes, in the first instance, that will be outside so people can respect social distancing and reduce infection. There's a different approach, obviously, in England, as you appreciate, because the 2-metre rule or the 2-metre law and the 5-mile guidance is obeyed basically in Wales to reduce transmission. That's why our repeat infection rate is 0.5 when it's 0.9 in England, where they're obviously opening the bars, encouraging everyone to sort of, gather together and infect each other, it seems to me. Again, the idea is to do more for cyclists, make it easier to cycle, provide cycling proficiency and make streets safer to cycle, and to open up roads for pedestrianisation and community activity. Public transport. As the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, mentioned, we don't want to go on public transport, but the reality is we want more frequent public transport with social distancing and masks and cleanliness. I had a chat with the Deputy Mayor of London about testing of transport workers, because the reality is a lot of transport workers are off sick because they've got symptoms, but in fact some of them haven't got COVID, and so if they were all regularly tested, we'd have more tubes, therefore more social distancing and less infection. But on private transport, I would say it's important that we move forward on an electrified network and we invest in that. And sadly, the government has in fact given a lot of the franchise for the rollout of electrification to BP. It's like giving a burglar your sort of the strategy for looking after your house. Clearly, they've got a vested interest in continuing to sell us fossil fuels, but we need to basically get that right and roll this out very quickly. It's clear there's ideas for scrappage schemes, acceleration of conversion of buses and taxis and like to electric. And again, as I mentioned earlier, ensuring fossil fuel engine cars and other vehicles, new ones, aren't for sale after 2030, to focus the mind of both consumers and producers to move forward to a greener future, and also support a green air traffic. I know that sounds a bit ironic, but there are opportunities for carbon wings and this sort of thing from Airbus and others. And if we are going to fly, obviously, it should, in my view at least, it should cost more to fly, and it should be much less damaging to the environment. And I'm not very good at this. Wood and coal burning, people may not know, but something like nearly 40% of PM 2.5 is actually created by people burning logs and coal in their homes. And there is a move now by the government to at least stop people burning wet wood. But there's a strong argument, in particular in urban environments, not to allow anybody to burn wood and coal. Obviously, it's turned to be controversial, but there's a lot of unnecessary death and COVID infection caused by people burning things at home. In terms of agriculture, people don't talk about agriculture very much. Again, ammonia in particular in fertilizer gives off a lot of secondary particulates that gives rise to a lot of background particulates, and hence, you know, premature death and COVID infection. All right, I'm not very good at this thing. It's just mentioning home delivery services. Obviously, there needs to be coordination really if there's lots of deliveries going on, so that people do rounds and routes is sort of obvious. But in practice, what happens is if you order food from Sainsbury and you're in a queue, one order could be in one destination, another one miles and miles away, the next one next door to the first one. And, you know, it's not rocket science, but this is generated, you know, there should be more coordination, and this should be monitored and managed in a sensible way. There's an issue about indoor air quality. People don't, the reality is that that people assume, you know, when they're in their own homes that they're safe. But the reality is that now in lockdown, people are more exposed unknowingly to indoor air pollution. That could be from damp, it could be by a lack of ventilation. And if you sit in if you have a sort of, I don't know, a romantic dinner for two, burning a candle in a double glazed small room, you are in fact not doing yourself a lot of favors. I think there's a lot of chemicals that are inside furnishings, and actually people spray to clean their bathroom or their kitchen, or in fact put on their body or their hair, also problematic. And there can actually be a cocktail effect with air pollution outside and indoor air pollution that causes inflammation and the like. So in the Environment Bill, again, I'm proposing that there's greater restrictions on chemicals in particular in all these products. And particularly, people may know about flame retardants. In the average house, there's 14 kilograms of flame retardant in your sofa and mattresses and all this sort of stuff. And what happens is that leaches out. If you're in a t-shirt and you've got bare skin, it leaches out and penetrates your skin. If you're a young mother with an unborn baby, it's actually getting into your bloodstream. And these are nasty chemicals, and they're unnecessary to a large extent. So the test for fire retardant in America and the EU is a smolder test. And that test is if you left a cigarette butt on your sofa overnight, that it wouldn't catch fire. In Britain, the test is a flame test. So you have to, if you put a lighter against your mattress or your sofa, it won't catch fire. Well, it's a much higher test. So obviously it's in the interest of the chemical manufacturers, but it means you've got this enormous amount of chemicals in Britain, in your sofa, which doesn't exist in Europe, for example. And when people get rid of the sofas, there's requirement to burn them, which causes outdoor air pollution as well. And tragically, most people, of course, die from smoke rather than from flame in fires. So a lot of the deaths in Grenville were caused by flame retardant, ironically. So there is a pressing need to control chemicals indoors, not just flame retardants. There's all sorts of formaldehyde people have heard of, what's organic compounds, etc. So I'm pressing the government to have indoor air pollution anyway in the environment bill. And then, believe it or not, even though 90% of our time is spent indoors, the environment bill, which is supposed to be about clean air apart from anything else, doesn't include indoors. It's only outdoors, which is farcical. But anyway, I'm trying to put pressure on. The other thing to bear in mind is the environment bill is delivered by DEFRA, which is one particular department. And clearly, clean air is a public health issue. It's not just DEFRA. So I've been consistently raising the issue of clean air with the health secretary and suggesting that he's got responsibility minimally to have clean air in hospitals. But of course, the cost of unclean air is picked up by the health service. I've also been suggesting that we should have basically enforceable air quality limits, that if they're breached, fines should be paid to the health service, partly to help pay for the health damage they're causing. Clearly, some of these proposals are just lend themselves towards a new green agenda more generally, to push forward with a more sustainable, healthy future that's got lessons to be learned across the world. So in the Council of Europe area, which is 47 countries, is wider than Europe, by way of example, there's 750,000 deaths due to air pollution at a cost of £500 billion. There's a lot of money to be saved by keeping us all clean. And obviously, moving towards electrification and a cleaner future means that there's a direct impact on reducing climate change, which I know obviously is the primary focus, Extinction Rebellion. Hold on, what have I got? So I mentioned the Environment Bill. I had a meeting coincidentally yesterday with the Environment Minister and someone called Professor Stephen Holgate, who heads up for the Royal College of Physicians clean air initiatives, to try and press her to have indoor air pollution included, to have enforceable standards, and that those standards should be World Health Organization standards. None of those things are currently in the Environment Bill, and at the moment the Environment Bill is framed so that the Secretary of State for the Environment can set and change the air quality limits. So if she or he says it should only be 15 micrograms, or say they say it's 12, then the following year they could set it at 13. So it's completely ridiculous. And the worry is that people may know that the current government has been taken to court by various organisations for breaching, for Client Earth specifically, but for breaching EU air quality standards. Now, obviously, once we leave the EU, we won't have to pay fines to the EU for breaching these standards. And the concern is that our standards on this, amongst so many other things, will deteriorate. And in particular, there may be a Trojan horse impact on the environment in trade agreements that we agree. So again, what I'm trying to do is to have things built into trade bills that basically respect the Paris Agreement, public health, and our environment. I think, hold on, I'm almost finished. I think I've actually finished. There we are. I'll stop sharing that. And hold on, am I on screen? I don't know. I'm not very good at technology, but I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to take any comments or questions. Hopefully, I didn't go on too long. I had 22 minutes. I had 20 minutes. It wasn't that bad.
That's excellent. No, that was very wide-ranging and informative. Thank you very much. It's excellent. So we have got some questions that have come up already, but if you've got questions, please put them into the chat so that I can see who wants to ask the question. And as your questions come up, I will ask them. So Chris's question, first one, is what can we do to support the Clean Air Bill question? I guess as we, you mean Extinction Rebellion?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what would be good is, I mean, that strategy I just showed you, it obviously can be emailed to members, And also I can provide you with suggestions that you support, which are amendments to the Environment Bill. So specifically, what I'm after, or what the All Party Group is after, and other environmental groups, is that there are specific air quality targets in the Environment Bill to aim for, and those are enforceable. But secondly, that indoor air pollution is included, is referenced and included as a duty in the Environment Bill, because at the moment they're saying it's nothing to do with us, and obviously it is. And incidentally, increasingly, there's been a move. There's been some sort of fast and loose activity on house building, as people will know. And so, by way of example, when people convert blocks of office blocks to flats, sometimes their standard of ventilation and the like isn't very good, and you end up with all sorts of problems with chemicals, ventilation, and damp. But anyway, the short answer is I can send you something that perhaps could be distributed that people can write in, but and encourage others outside this constituency as well. I mean, the ideal, of course, is that people, not just in Swansea, but everywhere, sort of write to their MP and ask that the Environment Bill is toughened up. And on that, what I've done is through the Royal College of Paediatricians and Children, I've engaged with Mumsnet, and Mumsnet has got quite a big following, and we're putting stuff on that to get people to send emails to their MPs supporting these changes.
Alison, do you want to ask your question? Don't forget to unmute.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just wondering, and I think somebody else has subsequently, is there such a thing as green air traffic?
Don't lean towards the microphone, Alison. It distorts the sound. Stay back.
Because it seems like, how on earth
it's not working. I'm going to mute you.
It might be, I don't know whether it's because there's too many people with their microphones open at once.
No, everyone's on mute except the people talking. So Alison, just as she moved towards the microphone, but maybe we'll ask John to ask his, because it's a very similar question.
Yeah, Geraint, I'm very interested to understand how you think that there can be such a thing as green aviation. I spent a significant amount of my life flying 747s and other jet aeroplanes for airlines, and I can tell you now that the energy density required to get an airliner from A to B is intense, and I can't see how on earth we can think about green aviation. It defies physics, unfortunately. I'll be very interested to understand where you get that notion from.
Watching a seagull. but no, well, I take your point and I completely agree. I mean, the greatest, as you'll probably appreciate, the greatest growth in carbon footprint is aviation, and it's a real problem. And I've got, basically, it's an appalling problem because of course gasoline can't be taxed internationally very easily, and so nobody taxes it. So so we end up with a sort of bizarre situation where instead of taking the train to Edinburgh or whatever, people fly, and it's you can go to Lanzarote or whatever it is for less than you can get the train to London and back. So there's a big problem here. What I was getting at is if one accepts that there will be flying in the future, we need to ask the question, how can we ensure that flying is greener than it would have otherwise be? And the answer is partly to adjust to either ration the number of times people can fly, to increase the price of flying. But there are technological issues as well, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, in particular things like carbon, as opposed to a lighter aircraft obviously take less energy to lift off and this sort of thing. But I'm not here to defend the aircraft industry as such. I'm just saying there will be relatively, I'm not saying there are green aircraft, I'm just saying that there are ways to reduce the amount of air travel and to reduce the amount of carbon emissions per air mile. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd agree with the taxing of aviation as being the only realistic way that we can reduce emissions from that sector. The green technologies that they're trying to develop are just never going to cut it, unfortunately, not within the next 20 years at least.
Rose.
But, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Rose, would you like to go next? Unmute yourself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much. I was interested to read that DEFRA was asking for urgent requests. They asked for requests for research about the air pollution post-COVID, and I wondered if the findings had been published, Geraint.
Yeah. So. I understand they just have. I chair this all-party group, and what I initiated was just a call for evidence. This was a couple of months ago. Then we had a meeting where the people from Harvard, Queen Mary's, and York University, in fact, sort of beamed in a Zoom meeting like this and presented their findings, which basically there's more and more research around the world that shows a very strong correlation between air pollution and COVID death, and now infection, and indeed transmission as a transporting device on the particles. And what DEFRA have done is they've done more of that, so they got more and more evidence. But I've got to say, my view is, well, we know we don't need more and more evidence. We need to just have a strategy to reduce air pollution, not to keep reconfirming that smoking harms us. We know that, but that we should do something about it. So obviously I welcome the fact they've got more and more evidence. And as I mentioned, I had a meeting actually with the Air Quality Minister, Rebecca Powell, on Monday with the leading clinician on this, Stephen Holgate, just to press to have more in the Environment Bill, so a one-off opportunity to change things. So they've published their evidence, which basically shows pollution's killing us in even more ways than we thought. Carry on.
Is ozone classed as pollution?
Well, yeah. Well, ozone is a problem, and indeed, they've been saying, oh, well, when we got nitrogen oxides, which are more problematic for public health, down, there can be a knock-on that there's more ozone. There's issues about the ozone and the hole, and therefore having more sunlight coming in. So obviously there are biochemical issues and trade-offs, and we do need to think about ozone. But I'm not thinking about ozone very much. But yes, it's one of the things to consider.
I have asthma, so I am considering about ozone.
Right. Well, if you've got asthma, you're probably getting more problems from particulates and nitrogen oxides than ozone. But I'm not pretending we shouldn't talk about ozone. But obviously, I'm avoiding it.
Thank you.
Judy?
Right. You said something about the particulate filters in diesels. Now, 15 years ago, I bought a diesel car, as many of us did, because we were told it was a good idea, safe, better than petrol. And last year, I bought a diesel car again, but a Euro 6, because I thought it would be cleaner. And now you're telling me that actually it's worse. Could you please explain about the 300 miles? And does my AdBlue needing diesel improve things, or is there some terrible defect in that as well?
Yeah, I mean, the background to this is that Margaret Thatcher, God bless her, decided that she'd want to focus more on, it was known at her time that diesel particulates was a public health issue causing cancer and strokes and the like. But it was believed at the time that if people moved from petrol to diesel, that in fact there'll be less carbon emissions, and the primary focus was on climate change and not on public health. And people didn't sort of extrapolate to a situation where over 50% of the car production suddenly became diesel, partly for the reason you said, namely that you can get more miles to the gallon and the like. And on the particulates, the original concerns were about the larger sort of city particulates that come out of diesel, and over the years there's been an attempt to filter those down. But the problem we got now is that the most harmful particulates are the microcosmic ones. I mentioned in particular P2.5, which is one of the smallest. And the smallest one can sort of get into your bloodstream, into unborn babies and all this sort of stuff. You don't sort of catch it in your nose hair or anything. And the issue I mentioned, which is something that was found out relatively recently by an organisation called Transport and the Environment, is that these the particulate catches, whatever they're called, traps or whatever, in some of these new cars, the manufacturers have sort of outwitted the regulators, and the regulators have been testing these cars between these, as I call them, sort of 300-mile belches, where the particulates are sort of caught in these filters, and then every 300 miles they're spewed out. But the thing about them is they're also crushed at the same time, which reduces the average size of the particulates. And one of the problems with what I've been suggesting, namely this idea that we have a target for PM 2.5, is if you're a manufacturer who doesn't really care about public health, then you're going to think, I'll tell you what, they're measuring PM 2.5. If you crush them all into each PM 2.5 into 2 PM 1.25s, and they don't measure that, that would be a good idea. So we'll do it. And obviously they'll kill more people because the smaller particulates are deadly. And therefore, the solution really is to eradicate and get rid of all fossil fuel cars and vehicles, which is the plan for 2035. I'm suggesting it should be 2032. And in terms of your own sort of responsibilities, as it were, obviously people do feel annoyed that they're trying to do the right thing and they've then been told they're doing the wrong thing. And I respect that, and therefore support things like scrappage schemes.
Well, I agree with that. Just a quick question on that. Doesn't the burn off, you're supposed to burn off the particles, does that release them, or does that actually destroy them?
I don't know much about burn off. I think basically they're still, when you're burning these things, you don't get rid of them. They're sort of pumped out. So there are sort of problems. I mean, some particulates do sort of fall down, and there's a sort of view that it doesn't really matter too much if you're sort of zooming around on your own in the countryside. But obviously it is more damaging at close quarters. But really the only answer is to have a hydrogen or electric alternative, or to travel less. I mean, I'm a great believer in of traveling less and do more digital work. Like the meeting I mentioned with the people from Harvard, they were beamed in on a Zoom call like this from Harvard. Well, if they'd come over on a plane or something, that would have been ridiculous. And I've got to say, this might sound a bit, outrageous, but I'm not, for example, a great supporter of HS2, because the whole strategy seems to be we should travel further, faster, more frequently, and somehow we must do this. Well, I mean, we're meeting now on Zoom. We could be in any part of the country. Why don't everyone feel obliged to be on a train all the time? And all, of course, it does is pump up the price of a house in London all the time, because more people can visit there, and they basically undermine, in my view, the regional development elsewhere. Yeah, that's a separate issue. But the issues of transport, regional planning, and economic development are, integral to environmental sustainability and public health.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dawn.
Oh, thanks, Sue. Thank you, Geraint. One of the proposals that you mentioned in that report was for more monitoring and measuring of air quality. I'm wondering how that data can be better used to empower local communities to push for traffic reduction measures and more investment in cycling and schools, streets and road closures. I think air quality seems to be a key part of the argument. But for example, on High Street in Swansea and in Uplands, we don't really have the data, the localized data that would enable us to make those arguments. Have you got any advice as to where we might find localized data, or how communities can start to measure their own data and air quality in order to make those arguments?
Yeah, well, I think that's an absolutely critical issue because obviously we currently live in a democracy, and you know, clearly if MPs or AMs or MSs rather sort of post or email bags are full of people complaining, then they'll take action. And similarly, on a localized basis, if you've got a child in a local school and you know that because everybody's loitering outside the school with their engine on waiting for their child, no disrespect to any parents who do that here, and you know that that's causing on a cumulative basis, and if all the parents are there as they are all the time immediately outside the gates, then everyone assumes that when the children are in the playground jumping around happily, they're safe, when in fact they're breathing in all this unclean air. And on the indoor, as I'm at it, on the indoor clean air issue, if that school has, you know, so they've invested in lots of double glazing, then they do cost cutting on what cleaning chemicals they use in the school, and then the children come in, they say, oh, this smells nice, it smells of lemon or something, but really it's full of harmful chemicals that may be cocktailing with the outdoor emissions that are coming through the front door from the parents will, you know, hovering outside. Then those chemicals and those fumes are locked in an unventilated space. Then you may end up with a situation where those children, you know, are put at risk. And so it is important to have monitors, as you're saying, and to have measurements, and to know what they mean. That is, you know, what is safe, and then for parents to be able, therefore, empowered to say, actually, to the head teacher or to the local authority, we think that, you know, you should close the school, the road outside the school, but in I don't know, in the 3/4 of an hour interval when people arrive, you can open it after when there's normal traffic, if that's what you want, or you might want to close it completely. And so people know what's happening, to put pressure, I think as you're suggesting really, on local authorities in particular, in terms of planning, you know, and maybe we'd free up more roads and etc. And then clearly, if you've got a school right by a busy road or an old people's home or whatever it is, you know, you should need to know the risk. It might be the case that you change the traffic, or it might be the case that there's mitigating things that can be mitigation that can happen. For instance, by building hedges to stop. You know, if you can't stop the cars, you can stop some of the pollution, etc., etc. In terms of your question, so again, in this clean air bill I did, the suggestion was for more and more sort of monitoring and public awareness in order to get support behind this. Because if you don't have that support, what now obviously happens is, you know, the diesel or the car manufacturers and the petrol manufacturers will influence public opinion and say, oh, bloody hell, you know, oh, no, they're putting up the price of diesel, we can't afford that, we'll have a big strike. And as it happens, the price of petrol and diesel is historically low. Obviously, we're in a very difficult position now because we're coming out of this COVID, you know, pandemic. So it's not the sort of time people won't want us to put up tax on diesel at the moment, say, oh no, that's the last thing we want, and all the rest. But you know, raising the awareness, as you said, on a localized basis, which says, look, my child goes to that school and that's unacceptable, at least you can do is close down this road or something, is very powerful. Of course, the responsibility for those monitoring, as it happens in Wales, is devolved. So, but I mean, clearly, you know, insofar in a way, what I'm doing is pushing for these sort of things. In some of them would be UK things, but in terms of monitoring and the like, and obviously, if the levels of monitoring go up in England, then obviously that, you know, helps Wales as well. And on that, people may be aware through their own travels, for example, that if you go by car, which some may admit to, from here to, I don't know, Cardiff or something, that as you go past Port Talbot now, in recent years there's been a reduction in the speed limit to 50 miles an hour. Many people assume that's because of, you know, accidents and the like, but in fact it's because clean air standards were breaching EU limits, and obviously Port Talbot's got other issues, you know, the other things happening in terms of industry and steel, and that did have a power generation there until very recently. And so the Welsh government decided to introduce that speed limit to reduce the NOx levels. So again, I'm just saying that I'm agreeing with you, of course, that you know, that data and information provides empowerment and can help us campaign for more rapid change.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to skip to Anna just for a minute because her question is closely related to the last question, and then I'll go to Phil.
Thanks, Sue. Yeah, thank you very much, Geraint. That was, you know, really interesting talk. Yeah, I was just wondering, do we have the information on what's the main cause of pollution in Swansea? Is it from traffic, or is it from Port Talbot and the M4? Or, I mean, what's the worst culprit in terms of air pollution? So we know kind of where to direct our best efforts, really.
Yeah, I haven't got the detailed breakdown, but it could, obviously you know, it is the case that there's a bit of background, background pollution from Port Talbot, of course. But I mean, a lot of it will be localized traffic in localized areas. So I don't know, just by way of example, at Sketty Cross, I know there's quite a lot of traffic there, and I think the pollution levels are high there, and in various parts of Swansea is higher than other parts due to traffic. And as I mentioned earlier, there can be background from agriculture, but I don't think in Swansea we've got a particular problem with that. But I know I should have all that data to hand, and I will get it. I haven't got it. But clearly, what I'm basically saying is that in general we should be moving towards more public transport, electrified public transport, and cleaner cars. But yeah, I think there is a need for me as well as everybody to have more localized data. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Phil?
Couple of things. One of the first thing is about the speed of bringing this legislation through. I don't think anybody here is going, this is bad legislation. But the whole system that we've got in Parliament is so laggy. You know, we're talking about, in the next 5 years, the next 10 years, it seems like legislation has been passed about COVID almost instantly. But the wave of destruction that's coming because of the environmental damage and the environmental disaster is going to be considerably worse for not only our planet's health, but of course we live here, everybody's health. The other thing is that monitoring devices, I've just looked up, are relatively inexpensive. You can get monitoring devices for particulates and things for between £200 and £300. Shouldn't schools and other organisations be provided with those devices so that we can get local data? You know, I think that's.
Yeah. So on those points, I agree. So on the last point, you can get monitors, and I think you can get, obviously, you know, the cheapest, less reliable, I guess. But I've got a monitor in my kitchen to check I don't burn toast, I suppose, for about 30 quid. So, and I in fact had this monitor in the train going back from London, and found, of course, when the train switches from electric at Cardiff to sort of, because it's bimodal, to diesel, the in-carriage pollution gets worse, in fact. I mean, it's still sort of inverted commas healthy, but nothing's helped when you've got a few more PM 2.5 or whatever. And then in terms of the speed of change that you mentioned, you know, I agree completely. What I would say though is that because of the, you know, tragedy of the pandemic, obviously we're in a situation now where the economy has been closed down, and the big question is, you know, how should it be restructured as we move forward? And I know the Welsh government, in terms of business support, is asking 3 questions, which are, you know, does this investment support growth? Does it support sustainability and green growth? And is it inclusive in terms of, does it help local communities? Obviously, in the, you know, does it have workers' rights and trade union recognition, sort of thing. Meanwhile, what we're seeing is, and this is a great concern of mine, I've got to say, is that as we move towards the end of the transition period, when we Brexit, I mean, obviously, technically we've Brexited, but we're still, you know, not quite Brexited, because obviously the transition period only goes until the end of December. And my personal view is we should, as the Welsh Government's view is that we should have extended that, because we lost 6 months of negotiation and planning because of COVID. But what's happening is, because it's all been sort of crushed, we'll look like we're heading more, because of the belligerence of our government, we're more likely to head for a sort of win-lose scenario rather than a win-win. And the danger is that, well, quite rightly, arguably, but if you look at the investments that are going on in Germany and France, obviously we've got a budget tomorrow, so we'll see what comes out of the hat tomorrow. But to date, we're investing something like 133 billion in the economy in pounds, and the Germans are investing 253 billion euros, and they're putting, you know, multi-billion-pound investment into hydrogen, putting lots of money into, you know, green technology, electric vehicles and the like. And obviously, you know, it'd be good if everybody does this. So hopefully there will be, you know, that being said, you know, it'd be nice to have a coordinated effort rather than a competitive effort. But this is what I'm trying to get at is, I agree that everything's very slow, but maybe this is the opportunity to change gear and to reinvest in a green future, while we're thinking, rather than go back to our bad old ways. And in terms of air pollution, what, you know, one of the reasons I've been banging on about this is, if everyone just sort of says, all right, lockdown's over, we'll all get back in our cars and avoid public transport, as the Prime Minister at one point said, then obviously we could end up with a worse second peak of COVID, and obviously no real improvement to the climate or the environment. So hopefully there's a wake-up call, and there will be faster green change, but, you know, all we can do is push for that.
Yaz and Tez?
Pardon?
So the next questions are from Yaz and Tez. Are you there? We can't hear you.
How about you read it out?
Hello?
Hello? Great.
Great, okay. Okay, regarding the agricultural element of the Clean Air Act, you mentioned the harmful impact of ammonia fertilizer. Now, I was pleased to see that you'd mentioned agriculture at all. Have there been any considerations for the methane from the dairy industry? Because it's 5 times more damaging than carbon. And if you've ever been in a chicken farm, for instance, it's not the only, fertilizer isn't the only source of atmospheric ammonia. So I believe that animal agriculture needs to be taken into account. Are you making any considerations for that?
Yeah, well, it's yes and no. What I say is that methane is particularly problematic. I mean, the focus of what I've been talking about today has been about public health and emissions and air pollution. What you're, you know, talking about is methane emissions, which is particularly damaging for climate change. So I understand that over a 20-year time frame, methane is something like 85 times worse than carbon dioxide. And that was one of the I mean, I put in this bill, I'm going off the point slightly here, but I put down a bill on fracking that was basically saying, it pointed out that fracking, 5% of the methane, as you know, fracking is basically blowing, you know, hydrochloric, blowing water, hundreds of chemicals into the ground and allowing out the gas. 5% of that gas gets emitted. And because methane is 85 times worse than CO2, in fact, fracking is much worse than coal for climate change. So methane is a big issue generally. And in terms of cows, as you say, I think in terms of climate change, I think I'm right in saying that 15% of climate change is caused by sort of cattle and other animal production, but primarily in places like the United States or places which are, you know, harvesting cows or, you know, rearing cows or whatever in Brazil and elsewhere for, you know, McDonald's or whatever happens to be. And there are issues about how you do it as well. I mean, if you are going to eat meat, you're better off having it in a sort of free range environment than a sort of an intensive American farm where there's lots of grain being fed to these cows that are also emitting a lot of methane. So there are issues around that. And I think, I can't remember the figures now, but I think if you're a vegan, then you're using something like an 18th of the land that you would use as a carnivore, as it were, person eating meat virtually every day. So there are issues to contend with, but it's more about climate change than about air pollution and public health from air pollution. But, you know, I take your point. I'm not advocating here, by the way, that you should get rid of all cows. But I mean, obviously, if you know, people reduce the amount of meat they eat, obviously that would have an impact on climate change. I mean, obviously, if the average United States person, for example, ate meat every day, but then they chose instead to have a couple of days off, that would make quite a significant difference, for example. And more generally, if the signal is that as you become more prosperous, it's a sort of good thing to do to eat loads of meat, and there has been the signal, then as more and more countries, you know, quite rightly, get higher standards of living, I mean, the signal really should be you're better off in every respect, health and climate, eating more vegetables. But I do eat meat, so we're clear, but not very much. But yeah, your point's well made.
I'm sorry that I missed a question earlier, which is really important, especially in our action yesterday. So Val, I'm sorry, I missed your question in the chat. So ready for you now.
Oh, hello, thank you, Sue. Yeah, just wondering, Geraint, if you've got any ideas how we can actually support, encourage, lobby, campaign the council to actually take on some of these suggestions, like the cycle lanes and other positive initiatives. I think Phil said something similar as well. How we all know how pressing this is, and how can we actually get the legislation to be pushed through more quickly?
Yeah, well, I guess there's I've been talking about national legislation in the main, but as people have been saying here, you know, the world is local, and whether it's as it was previously mentioned about the air quality outside schools, for example, then obviously, or provision, as you've said, of cycle lanes, one can do petitions and campaigns locally and get engaged with local councillors to move forward on that. And the council is responsive, and you know, they have passed passed motions and the like about, you know, taking initiatives on these issues. And I think there is a move and a mood in the council to do something about outside schools. And so in a way, we may be pushing at an open door. But in answer to your question, how do you sort of get things done? You know, engagement with local councillors and petitions and this sort of thing, and the local newspaper can be helpful. And similarly, whether it's your member of parliament or your member of the Senate or whatever, it's important, you know, often putting pressure on people who are your representatives is helpful to them, because it gives, you know, them, it's not annoying or anything, certainly not for me, because otherwise you're sort of thinking you're the lone voice talking about the environment, nobody cares type thing. So it's a good thing to do, what Extinction Rebellion is generally doing. And petitions and letters and emails and public events and letters to the paper and the media all add to that. But I guess from the point of view of the meeting and the like, I suppose it's a matter of having some collective focus on naming a couple of things that you might want changed, and then all participating and putting pressure on, rather than all doing different things at different times, which have less impact, if that's helpful.
Thank you. So I think everyone who wanted to speak has spoken. Rose has got another question up. So if anybody else wants to ask another question, John had a comment, I think. Yes, so before I go to Rose, because some people might start leaving, just wanted to say that next week's talk is going to be for the region. So that will be going out for you to sign up on Eventbrite. Dawn, did you want to have just a quick say about what your talk's going to be about, and then we'll go to Rose?
Thanks, Sue. Well, I have no idea. Chris has only just asked me on tonight's call if I'll speak next week, but I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk a bit about what we're doing for the region to try and help promote the transition of our region towards what we're calling a well-being economy. So yeah, I'll look forward to taking any questions and exploring it further next week. Thanks for the invitation to speak.
Thank you, Dawn. Okay, Rose?
Thank you very much. And thank you all for a very interesting meeting, and thank you, Geraint, for doing this. I was just wondering about the role of highways departments in the whole of the UK, because they have such an important role to play, and I don't know whether they're included in any of these sort of conversations. And they're involved in developments all over the country, not just in Swansea. And I wondered what you thought, Geraint.
Yeah, well, I completely agree. So one of the points I was impressing on DEFRA is that they've got this environment bill, but, you know, if we're honest, they haven't got the machinery to deliver, and it's got to be an all government approach, which is you know, if we want a greener future, then a couple of days ago, Boris Johnson announced another 100 million on road building, then, you know, it doesn't sort of add up. So we need to have an idea of, you know, where we want to be and how we get there and where the investment needs to be. I mean, in my distant past, I was involved in delivering a sort of tram system, electric tram system. But again, in Swansea, one could imagine, and we obviously are really, historically, there used to be a tram running to the Mumbles, for instance. But I mean, you know, having an electrified railway on a localized basis, and I've been pressing with Swansea Metro, the public transport in Swansea isn't great, is it? And people, and it rains quite a lot. So people, you know, have got some sort of excuse for jumping in cars all the time. But really, we need a sort of integrated system that's properly funded and properly coordinated. And I think, again, the council behind the scenes, I think Swansea, East Talbot and Carmarthen Council are talking about the possibility of, for example, starting up a local bus company. And if that was run by the local authority and with electric buses and there's a charging infrastructure, I know again the council looking to transfer its fleet to electric vehicles. And then over time, you know, if we ended up, for instance, with a Swansea Bay Lagoon, and which is structurally financed in a different way, which is being looked at now and has added value. My understanding is, you know, looking at a situation where the cost of the lagoon would be less, that there would be, you know, hydrogen and oxygen production in the lagoon as well to add value. That the local authorities, not just Swansea but others, would commit to buying electric over a longer time scale to reduce the risk and therefore the cost. We end up with a situation where we've got a sort of electrified infrastructure provided by Waves, also providing local bus transport in an affordable way to our communities to provide connectivity and therefore, you know, economic resurgence in a sustainable way. So, you know, the issue is about sort of, you know, I don't know, joining the dots and moving forward, and not simply building more roads and putting diesel cars on them.
Well, we're lucky we've got the Wellbeing and Future Generations Act in Wales, which stopped that big M4 extension. And Sophie Howells said it didn't meet the criteria for.
Yeah. So on that, I mean, again, and what we need to do, I mean, obviously people may say, oh, well, you know, how are we going to get to A to B and all the rest of it? And there is a case to be made, and I'll be trying to make it about our rail connectivity. So if you take Swansea, Cardiff and Bristol as a region, and I know people, you know, say, oh, Bristol's outside Wales, but as a unit, that's 3 million people, which is the same as Leeds, Manchester. But Leeds, Manchester has 6 trains an hour, and I think we got 1 or something. So, I mean, if we connect, you know, things up, and we can help those economies through rail rather than roads. And if it is the case that we decide to do more of our business in Zoom calls and online rather than having to travel about all the time, and if we have more mixed working, so that instead of either you work from home or you work in an office, you know, it's a bit like the meat eating example. You're spending 2 days in the office and 3 days at home or whatever. Not everyone can do this, I realise, but it's just a matter of if you can take some of the traffic off the road, then the argument to have the extra M4 relief road is relieved by the fact there's less cars on the road because we're operating differently. And if alongside that you have electrified or hydrogen generated railways, which are more reliable and frequent and affordable, then you can move forward in a sustainable way.
Well, it's a nice positive note to end on. We've gone over time a bit, but I think that's testimony to the interest in the topic and all the questions that people put up. It was a very interesting talk. I certainly learned a lot that I didn't know. I don't know if I'll remember those facts though. I'm not very good at remembering the importance of particulates and their numbers, but I got the gist of it. So thank you very much for giving us your time. The talk's recorded, so people will have a chance to look at it who couldn't come, and hopefully it will be disseminated far and wide. Chris, did you want to say anything?
I may say finally, just in thanking everyone for their interest in coming along, I can provide some, something that could be shared in terms of information that could be shared online amongst members and suggestions on what they might do as well. And I'm sure, and I'd be very interested in any initiatives this group and other groups takes in the future to continue down the green road that we want to progress. But thank you all again. I'm grateful for.
And if any of you are on Twitter, Geraint quite prolifically tweets about all these things. You can keep up to date with what he's doing and the pressure he's putting on people. What is it at? Is it just at Geraint Davies?
Is that Geraint Davies MP? At
Geraint Davies MP. Oh yeah, there must be millions of Geraint Davies. Yeah, not MPs.